Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to get started. It's been a really exciting workshop so far, and we have an exciting set of 3 presentations. Maybe just to sort of build on some of the points that have been made that I think are really relevant and set the stage for our presentation here. We heard from speakers in the Northeast how distributed or behind the meter storage is becoming an increasing component of load to the point of where it is impacting load shapes. We also talked about weather impacts on both load and renewable generation and how having an understanding of those weather impacts on all renewables, including behind the meter PV, is really important. In some of our work in GridLab, we've actually modeled as much as 20 gigawatts of behind the meter PV in one of our California studies. That's not an insignificant amount. So really getting a handle on the different methods for modeling behind the meter PV as well as behind the meter storage, I think is a really, really critical point towards the overall load forecasting challenge. So we're going to start with a presentation by Paritosh, and it gets into really great tool that NREL has made available to the public as an open source model called dGen. And it's been used by different clients around the US, and we're going to learn a little bit more about that. So we're going to start from the methodological side and then get more into some of the different kinds of applications of different load forecasting methods. So I will hand it over to Paritosh.
Is it better now?
Yes.
People in the back? Awesome. Thanks for having me and giving us the opportunity, ESIC, to be part of this. I think it's always a great learning for me as a presenter, but also as just as a participant, sitting over there and learning new things that have evolved so over the years and over utilities, over different countries, different research methods that even working in a national lab, you won't be able to comprehend. So it's always a great opportunity to be part of ESIC and both in the spring and other fall sessions as well. My name is Priya. I'm a senior research engineer at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. So I've made the arduous journey of traveling 12 miles from Golden, Colorado to be downtown over here. So this is awesome. Let's move to our talk of this particular session, which revolves about rooftop PV and behind the meter storage, and what are we doing from the modeling framework to analyze that and understand that from the locational perspective, from forecasting perspective, and how they can be incorporated in various forecasts for utilities, ISOs, RTOs, city planners, who might not have access to a number of data sets, data, algorithms, and how we can generalize the methodology for people to look behind the curtain and see what these methods are all about, what the data sets are being incorporated, how are they being incorporated, just to have a general sense to advance the state of the art that we have right now, to improve it as much as we can in the near future. So why I think I'll be talking to the wrong people if not in this session about why it is important for including DR resources in load forecast. So I made the slide for PV, but it also includes think about PV plus storage as well. So a lot of PV we are seeing in the system, but has been increasing tremendously because of not only economics, but a lot of federal incentives like investment, like IRA, like Build Back Better. So how do we capture a lot of these growing trends in adoption of rooftop PV and storage that are coming online in these 5 years, 10 years into our forecasting models going forward? Excuse me. So it's really important to quantify that, but also it's important to geospatially locate or geospatially have some resemblance about where those new resources are going to come up. And they have a lot of importance, as you always already know, about replacing aging infrastructure, distribution planning, new investments that needs to go in decades, 5 years, 10 years earlier than those actually come up. So how do we plan for them better is, I think, the theme of the whole load forecasting session. Hosting capacity analysis, I think we talked about that a little bit in last session, in a couple of sessions here as well. How DERs play a major role in hosting capacity analysis as well. And the last point, but not the least, thinking about policies and incentives. How do we quantify those effects going forward, capture those effects, maybe think about newer policies, newer rate tariffs, how to designing of newer policies and incentives that have worked historically, that are currently working, or needs to be evolved in the near future. What would be the next IRA in 5 years, 10 years down the lane? What are the next ITC extensions, or even a different perspective about federal and state incentives that might come in? What is the intention of these incentives would be? Do they actually value the resources that we are evaluating? Does it have a monetary compensation mechanism that works or doesn't work? So there are different things happening within the US and outside as well. But within the US, various utilities, various regions, there's a different flavor of all the things that you can see. How do we can capture all these flavors to come up with quantitative analysis is what we try to put in our modeling frameworks. So what are the key motivations for DR adoption? As we would already know, I think economics is a big piece of people being motivated to put rooftop PV or storage into it. So how much does it save on my utility bill? What is my bill savings going to be month to month or a yearly basis? How can we accurately incorporate those prices and policies within the modeling framework is quite important. The second important aspect is consumers influenced by spatial or social needs or social effects. So we see that, we inherently see that, but we do not see that in data, because we always look at the data and see, like, here is where a lot of PV is coming in. In this particular neighborhood, we are seeing a lot of PV. But when we look a lot of deeper into the data, those demographic data might not, or the economics data might not show up why a lot of these adoptions are happening in some neighborhoods as compared to other neighborhoods. That, for example, if you're in Beverly Hills in California, a lot of these rich neighborhoods, when you drive through the neighborhoods, you'll see a lot of solar rooftop PV. You would also see a lot of EVs. You would also see a lot of swimming pools out there as well. So there seems to be a lot of coherence in terms of the spatial with the social peer effects that might come in. By social peer effects, you might also think about, if my neighbor has PV or my sister has PV, does it motivate me in one way or the other in adopting PV or for myself, PV plus storage for myself as well? How do we capture those in our modeling frameworks? Historically, everything has been just economics, which is good. I think economics is a big piece of it, but there are all these other variables and characteristics that we still need to get into our modeling framework to understand these regional adoptions, large-scale adoptions, even much more in a better aspect. Other variables that we do not see but are already inherent: pro-environmental norms, innovativeness, social support. The challenge being, how do we capture that into our models? Is the data available? How rigorous are those data sets? What is the confidence level on those data sets? Can those data be scaled from one county or one neighborhood in maybe East Coast to somewhere in Texas? There might not be a one-to-one significance or congruence in those regions. So it has to be specific to a neighborhood, specific to a locality, and specific aspects play a role in those decision makings. So at NREL, it's been 5 to 6 years. We have developed this model called the distributed generation market demand model, which is an agent-based model, which helps forecast adoption of rooftop PV, behind-the-meter storage, small-scale wind, and geothermal by different regions and sector till 2050. So by agent-based model, we have deliberately set this model as an agent-based model because it helps us with a lot of flexibility in terms of data, in terms of understanding various regional and spatial trends as we move with more sophisticated modeling of their decisions, their behavior into these consumer decisions about moving with one technology or the other. The model has been supported by DOE for a number of years and has been included to be part of a lot of several key analysis, the DOE's solar future study, storage future study, all the future study related to distributed wind as well. So a lot of forward-looking scenarios were related to PV, storage, small-scale wind, looking into number of scenarios down the lane till 2050, looking at different aspects of policies, cost and stuff. How do we come up with a plan about different pathways that the country can take, looking from the PV, storage, and small-scale wind perspective? We have also done a lot of studies, not from DOE as well, which is one of the LA 100 studies, a number of studies with utilities as well that we have been incredibly lucky to be part with. One of the studies that we are doing with DOE as well is on the Puerto Rico 100 study that is currently underway, looking into more of the resilience aspect of PV plus storage that it can provide, as Puerto Rico has been hammered with a lot of hurricanes all number of years. Every year it has become a bigger phenomenon, and the transmission grid and the distribution grid, how do we help PV plus storage be a big part of the grid hardening of the Puerto Rico grid? As I was mentioning, agent-based modeling provides a lot of flexibility in terms of wrangling the data, disaggregating, aggregating back the data in different geospatial domains that helps in, so if we have load at a particular parcel level data sets or data sets that are very granular or not granular, how do we, agent level modeling helps in overlap all these data sets one level on top of each other so that we can derive meaningful data and analysis from them. So why is spatial adoption or looking into spatial domains important? Spatial domains, as I was mentioning, is key important because there's a lot of variance that we will see when we aggregate things up might not come up in our analysis. So if we can understand what driving different adoption decisions, maybe it's load, maybe it's the income level, maybe it's rich neighborhoods, or maybe it's a different combination of apartment buildings or single family households. So disaggregating those on that level by geospatially helps us build that bottoms up model that helps drive the other decision-making analysis that we would do later. So attributes, so within the agents, we have assigned a lot of attributes that we would be using moving forward with. So such as what kind of buildings they are, what kind of consumers they are, consumers in different rate classes, different types of buildings that, as Arthur was talking about, if within the residential classes, single family, multifamily, dicing it with owner occupied, renter occupied, looking from those perspectives, we can disaggregate loads, which be a bigger portion of it. And then we would have other things, we can add other things of it, such as where it's located, what kind of building it is, what is the rooftop characteristics of it, tilt and azimuth, what utility it is within that particular zone, what are the rate tariffs that it subscribes to, what are the policies and incentives on the state level, utility level, and the federal level that applies to particular agents. So agents can be statistical, but they also can be individual. So think about individual households making decisions. So in this particular study that we did, it's in international, so it's in Colombia. So we looked at a particular city, looking into adoption potential for that particular city. And the figure in the building use types, we disaggregated buildings by residential, industrial, commercial. But we did also have subcategories within the residential and the CNI consumers as well. This just aggregates back up to give a figure on where neighborhoods or what locations are we expecting a lot of PV to come in, specifically with respect to Colombia. One of the frameworks, I won't go much detail within this particular framework, but this, the dGen model use a bottoms-up mechanism or a framework for simulating consumer adoption decisions. So we start with the very bottom, which is the resource. Think about resource, where you're located, how much resource is available, just on that perspective, on a very broader lens. So you can think about it as a bigger pie, and the pie keeps on decreasing as we move up ahead the pyramid. So then we move into the technical aspects, such as I'm located here, but what kind of building it is it shading? Is there a tree nearby? What is the angle? What's the tilt and azimuth of my roof? How much capacity of technically my rooftop can, for PV, my rooftop can provide? If nothing is considered, like just technically, how much would it be possible? Then we move into the important piece of economics. So thinking about the technology costs, how much install costs, maintenance costs for PV, for installing rooftop PV comes through. What rate tariff am I in? What are the incentives that I am eligible for from the utility side, from ITC, from the federal side, from the state side as well? How does that play a role in my payback periods, my bill savings that I might get? Frankly, getting into cash flow analysis for each of those consumers or each of these agents. So those might be group of agents or individual agents, talking about individually there. But then we move into the market aspect of it. So what kind of policy regulations there might be, competition with other energy resources. So we generally work with, pair this work with capacity expansion modeling, where we are not looking from a lens from just rooftop PV and storage, but other resource technologies that are available that are least cost. How is rooftop PV competing with those technologies as well? I think the key crux of the dGen model or the modeling framework here is we want to capture behavior and decision making in the core of it. So we talked about all the technical aspects of it, all the economics aspect of it, but how agents in this particular framework can make decisions unilaterally or as a group in together, simulating an agent's behavior. So a group of agents might be certain residential rate classes with a certain load profile, maybe as large, medium, or an average load consumption, and a load profile that we can replicate that represents a group of consumers. So we have used a lot of surveys to calibrate some of these models, because surveys, what helps with running surveys, using surveys in our modeling framework, is it gives both stated and preferred preferences that consumers might have, and that might not be evident from historical data that we have seen. So we depend on data while we are calibrating the model, and John has talked, and Arthur has talked about that earlier as well. Calibrating the model from historical data sets where primarily that S-curve where adoption has happened all together. So from 2010 till 2022, these are the adoptions that have happened historically. And we use the S-curve to parameterize that. But I think surveys play a major role in helping add much more teeth into getting preferences from consumers that we have surveyed to see what makes sense for them. Are people more oriented towards bill savings? Is bill savings a more driving criteria when we're talking about just economics? Or payback period is another criteria for them? So thinking about that perspective, how can we quantify some of those uncertainties through surveys, I think it's a big help in calibrating that S-curve. We talked about PV a lot. I think just getting a sense about storage as well. So right now, the model is set up for PV plus storage, but we can handle storage as standalone as well. So some of these dispatch strategies that is traditionally there in the model right now is looking at peak shaving strategy, but also another strategy that we have used is the price signal strategy, and looking into different motivations for maybe a CNI customer as compared to a residential customer. Some of the recent work that we are trying to do in Puerto Rico is looking into more of the resilience aspect that storage can provide going forward. So there are a combination of strategies that are there right now, but a lot of work is underway to look into advanced dispatch strategies for the various classes of consumers. Some of the historical work that we have done, as I was mentioning about the LA 100 study, if you haven't, let me go back. Okay. If you haven't looked at this particular study, it's a 12-chapter study, goes into much more detail, just not on the distributed PV front, but goes into hosting capacity, capacity expansion, rates, jobs. So this is a study that we did for the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, helping them give them prospective scenarios or pathways to achieve 100% renewable energy generation in the future. So I would highly suggest looking at, even if not for rooftop PV, but overall, I think it's a great study to give a lot of perspective about 100% studies. And that's a good start about thinking about what are the challenges that we face there. Another study that we did is with the Orlando Utility Commission. So this is much more on the distribution level. I know we have a session after this looking into distribution planning. So this helps, at least our work with the OUC helped quantify some of the hosting capacity work that they were interested in, and which nodes, which feeders that they were expecting a lot of PV to come in. So we overlapped a lot of feeder level work that they had done with a lot of NREL work that we had done on the PV front, and how does that collaborate with the overall structure. Moving quickly to some of the current research work that we have been part with. Two current DOE projects that is running as we speak one is co-located and one is rider. The co-located is a collaborative project led by EPRI, NREL, and LBNL. So EPRI is the PI on it, and NREL and LBNL are key components of the co-located project. This is where we look into much more from the survey perspective. So looking into co-adoption of rooftop PV, running surveys for commercial and industrial consumers, EVs being a big part of it. The second one, which is rider, it's a NREL-led project by CETO, where we are looking much more into the data aspect of it. There's a much correlation with co-located and rider. Co-located looks into surveys, look into preferences for PV plus storage plus EVs, what consumers prefer. We are working with 6 utilities over there, where rider complements that is with data sets. We are in the process of developing a lot of data sets, sub-county level, a lot of agent level data sets, loads, consumers, resources, technical potential, a lot of those sets that would be publicly available for all of us, so that even people who don't have access to specific data sets, a lot of these data sets would be available for people to use and for doing regional analysis for a city, or even for an ISO and RTO to do more complex algorithms. And my final slide, I know we talked a lot about uncertainty and what are the different levels of uncertainty. Some of the work that we have done and we feel are the key drivers of uncertainty, and I have classified them into techno-economic drivers, policy market drivers, and operational drivers. Looking into the cost, electricity prices, load growth, something that there is uncertainty, but I think we can capture that or calibrate those. The major one is the policy and market drivers, where we don't have much more visibility in the future, in like 20 years down the lane, 15 years down the lane. So incentives, net metering, is net metering going to be there or not? big discussion in California, NEM 2.0 to NEM 3.0, has a major effect. So those policy decisions play a major role in adoption of newer technologies. Going to operational drivers, something that we talked about yesterday and today as well, oversimplifications. Are we going too deep, but we don't have the data to support it? Or is it too aggregate that it doesn't add value to some of the analysis that we are trying to do? Lastly, modeling methods, source code. We want methods, algorithms, data sets to be publicly available. So people can go look under the hood, see what is important, what is not important, what works, maybe provide a transparent platform to have a discussion that this is wrong, this doesn't work out, this should be added with this to make much more reasonable justification for the results to come out with. I think that's basically it. Thanks so much for giving the time.
Thank you so much, Paritosh. Our next, for a very, very comprehensive tour of dGen. I'm sure there are a lot of questions, but we're going to hold all questions clarifying and discussion questions until the very end. So our next speaker is Schaefer from Cadeo Group. And we're actually going to learn about another tool for forecasting behind the meter PV and storage. And also this tool is, as well as similar to dGen, is also open source, developed originally for utility. Very excited to learn about your work, Fred.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay in the back? Thank you. Thank you. All right. So I'm going to talk about locational solar and storage forecasting and maybe adjust the screen here. The tool that Priya just mentioned is called Adopter, and that is something that my colleagues and I have developed at Cadeo. We're a consulting firm, but it is a site-level simulation model that estimates the locational 8760 hour load impacts for 40 distributed energy resources. So I'm going to unpack a couple of terms on this slide here before I move on. When I say locational, I think about like feeders or census tracts or something that sort of correlates with the distribution system. And then for DERs, I'm talking here about solar and storage, but we also look at transportation electrification, building electrification. I'm forgetting something. Oh, flexible loads and demand response. So all the things that we've talked about up on this stage over the last couple of days are something that my tool here works with. The framework with which I do that, I'm showing here up in the screen. There's 3 steps that I want to cover here. First up, we'll talk about adoption and how we come up with an adoption forecast. And then for solar in particular, size matters. Size is important. They'll talk about how we get a size for each solar install, and then talk about hourly load impacts. So together, these 3 things form an 8760 load forecast. For my presentation, I'm going to apply this to residential behind the meter solar. I'll kind of clean up some of the loose ends because this is a solar and storage talk. I'll clean up some loose ends at the end of the presentation here. For the math nerds in the audience, I did leave the unit conversions in the bottom so you can kind of see how that fits together. So first step here, adoption. So where we've started this with solar anyway is a service territory adoption forecast. A couple of things I'll mention here is it's important to calibrate to current adoption. So what's actually out there on the grid now. And then from there, looking forward, we use a diffusion model, dGen, the fact that Paritosh just went through, use a diffusion model to cast forward and going to put a shape on that adoption curve. Paritosh did a much more detailed job than I'm going to do here, but what that diffusion model does is it accounts for the economics, technology costs, incentives, your utility rates, electric consumption, and so on. So this again gives us a service territory level of service territory forecast of adoption. But that's really not where I want to stop. I want to get this down to a locational level. So on this next slide, I'll talk about that. And I feel like this is something that we've talked about up on the stage for the last couple of days as well, thinking about a propensity model or something to take that overall storage forecast, or sorry, overall solar forecast, and then push it down across the service territory. So starting off with just the premise that some sites are more likely to adopt than others, we'll fit a binary classification model to figure out, how do we do that allocation. So what usually pops out of those propensity models are the suspects like that you would expect: building type, income, renting versus owning, neighborhood effects, those sorts of things. But from that group of variables that we can then score each site in the service territory. The chart that I'm showing up on the screen here is an example of some rank ordering. So if we look at that and say like, okay, the highest propensity scores look like they're 8 to 10 times more likely than the lowest propensity scores to adopt solar. So that's something we can use to get down to the household level. So taking all that framework and now putting it on a chart, showing two pictures here. The picture on the left is a site level detail of what comes out of that propensity model. This is actually my neighborhood in the suburbs of Portland. So that the dots represent where we think solar adoption is likely to happen. And then rolling that up to more of a distribution level, what I'm showing on the chart on the right is census tract level adoption rates. So we can kind of see how that varies across the service territory based on those propensity scores. So that gets us adoption. After adoption, then we have to think about size. How many kilowatts are on each rooftop? So to develop that size assumption, I've been relying on historic data. So working with utilities to get their interconnection data and come up with a distribution of the solar sizes. That's the chart in the bottom left of the screen. I think that's a pretty good source, something I've been working with, comfortable with. I think there are probably better sources that we could use in the future. I call out Project Sunroof from Google. The screenshot is again of my house here. That actually can show like, well, what's actually feasible on each rooftop. That's wonderful, but I found that it's proprietary. Google has some terms of service around that me, a consultant, I can't really tangle with. But that's something that I think there's potential to do something like that in the future. The other thing that I have wrestled with a little bit is tools like Sunroof. They give you a recommended size. I've had solar installers come to my house and come up with quotes, and the sizes they've come up with are a little bit different. So the most recent quote that I got was for about 8 kilowatts, which is not quite the 9.8 that my house shows. But coming up with that size assumption is something that's important for our modeling. So we need something. So I think the historic data is probably the best reference point for that. And then from adoption sizing, then we need to apply a load profile to each. So I've used PV Watts, which is another open source tool, and it's created unitized load shapes. So what by that I mean, if we take 1 kilowatt of solar and push it through, what's the hourly generation profile that comes out of that? So once we have that hourly generation profile for a kilowatt of solar, then we can scale it up, based on our household or premise level adoption, can scale that up to any level of detail up above that, be it service territory, a feeder, a census tract, and so on. So the shapes themselves look very similar. I guess I forgot to mention orientation and tilt. We have a couple of representative orientations and tilts that we run through the PV Watts tool. I know that each household varies in reality, but there's enough complexity as there is. We just model a few. So that sort of gets us through the approach that I've been using for coming up with solar forecasts. Just to close up a few loose ends, I talked about residential solar. Definitely use a similar approach for non-residential solar. I do feel obligated to talk a little bit about storage. I will say that I've got some today assumptions that I put up here on the slide. Today, I would say that standalone storage is rare. A lot of the similar approaches with propensity modeling sort of fall apart with lack of current adoption, in my opinion. So, in the future, as standalone storage maybe becomes more common, then we can use a similar approach. Again, my opinion for that. So today what I'm using is an attachment rate that just says, all right, well, if you install solar, then there's a certain probability you'll install storage as well. And I've been using that for my my forecast. The final bullet point I have on the slide here is thinking about scenario analysis. There are a lot of assumptions that go into what I just talked about. So I feel that scenario analysis is critical in terms of coming up with a good forecast. So at a minimum, I'll show a low adoption scenario and a high adoption scenario to bookend what I think, the uncertainty might look like. I think that's an important part of what we do in terms of forecasting. So that sort of covers the solar and storage space. I'm running rather short in time, so there'll be plenty of time for questions afterwards. My last slide here, I'm actually going to combine two of my least favorite things, public speaking and being vulnerable. So I'll just talk about some challenges that I've encountered along the way. So data acquisition, I've just found is a bit of a challenge. So I mentioned Project Sunroof as like, the white whale, but even some of the tools from NREL like PV watts, they're rate limited, or some other stuff might be proprietary. So thinking about scaling that up to a service territory that has several 100,000, or I'm looking at John, the ISO region, that has millions of homes, that may or may not be practical. The panel sizing thing that I mentioned, that can be complex too, because there's tariffs and whatnot that play into that as well, and trying to calculate that on a household level is a bit of a challenge. A couple of places where I've faced some tough questions as well, calibration to actual adoption, using a diffusion forecast like dGen. I've been challenged in the sense that that may or may not look like what the utility is experiencing on the ground today. So it's important to take that into consideration, what's actually happening, and calibrate your forecasts accordingly. And then the ever-evolving incentive programs are something that we have to grapple with as well. I think there's a lot of noise in the diffusion model, a lot of sources of error, and the uncertainty bands are pretty big. And I, quite honestly, I think that some of the federal, state, local incentives sort of fall in that noise as well. But as a consultant, I have to come up with an assumption for that. So that's been a bit of a challenge. Low income as well. There's not a lot of low income solar adoption in particular. But there is definitely programs for that. So to address, what the impact of that program might be is a question that I've been asked as well. And the final bullet point here on the slide are talking about scenarios versus statistics. One of the things that I have encountered in answering RFPs and questions from stakeholders is like, can you put a statistical confidence band on this? And I mentioned before, there are just so many assumptions that go into these models that statistics kind of fall apart. It's either really complex or just not possible at all. So again, I defer to scenarios almost exclusively in that context, and that's not always the most popular answer, but I think it's the way we need to do this. So those are a few of the challenges that I've faced, and the methodology that I've been using, and that's what I got. Thanks. Oh, here, yeah.
Oh, no. Okay, great. Thanks so much, Fred. Our next speaker is Brittany Farrell with Clean Power Research. I'm really excited about your presentation. I always had known CPR as sort of more focused on the forecasting from an operations lens and having all this access to great data. So very excited to learn how they're really leveraging that richness of data for thinking about the long-term forecasting of PV and storage.
All right, let's see. Can everyone hear me? Doing good? Okay. All right. Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you, Priya, for the introduction. So I'm Brittany Farrell, and I'm an energy systems researcher at Clean Power Research, CPR. And today I'm going to be talking about our take on behind the meter PV and storage adoption. Oops. That was not the right button. Okay, so like everything that we've been talking about, the big picture here is to understand load. So we want to understand it spatially at the service territory level, cities or counties, and down to, feeders or lines. And then we also want to understand it over time, what's happening within a day, what happens like seasonally, between the blue line in January and the green line in July in Arizona is just very different. And of course, what happens over many years, how is this load going to change? This is a total system peak day load. This is in the summer, what happens to that load over time? All right, and so of course, in this session, we're talking about solar and storage because just like many of the other sessions we've had, solar and storage have a huge impact on individual net loads. So this is one of my colleagues' homes. He has solar and storage, and so this is his load throughout the day for just a single day that I picked out of his data set. And this is what his solar system's doing. Negative is production here. He's got a 10 kilowatt system. He's got 2 power walls, and so you can see them charging in the morning time, and then there's sort of some intermittent time there where doesn't seem to be much happening, and then it's just charging in the evening. And so this is his net load. Looks very different from what we started from. And so if this is just a customer, a one-off customer in a sea of customers, doesn't really matter that much. But once there are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of customers affecting their load in this way, obviously that's something we need to worry about. So this is just kind of a summary of where we're going with this today. On the left, I've got an adoption model. So the actual adoption down there in the orange circles, and then the model in blue, and just kind of seeing what happens to that same peak day load as those adopters increase. So there's a blue line that's kind of hard to see because it's obscured there by the other lines, but it's very low in the morning and high in the afternoon. This is a summer day. And then once we get to 2040, hundreds of thousands of adopters, that line has changed significantly. The midday peak has dropped, and now we've got a ramp rate in the afternoon that's much higher. Okay, so I'll be going through kind of 5 different things that we think about and sort of the order we think about them. So first of all, just historical adoption. How many buildings already have solar and storage? Then we take that, that's where we're starting. Then we want to know the adoption potential. How many buildings could have solar and storage? We need to know how those lines connect, how fast that happens, and where will they be? And then, of course, I'll talk just a little bit about how that affects the local grid. All right, so we'll start with historic adoption. So CPR does our adoption modeling and essentially uses historical adoption to train the adoption model. So it's a little bit different than the way that like dGen works. And so we use this historical adoption model both to train that model, but then we also want to rule out future adoption for premises that have already adopted. We don't want to say, this neighborhood that's already, 30% solar owners will have another 60% of them. That doesn't make sense. So we use it to rule out those premises. And then we can also use the historical adoption data and the system sizes, et cetera, that we have from that to model the current grid conditions. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So the data that we look for in order to do this type of adoption modeling, first is just system location. This is kind of optional. If we're just doing a service territory, we don't need the exact location, but to break it down geographically, the location is needed. We also look for installation date and the system size. Now, if we're going to do production modeling, we also need that system location, that's key, the size. We want as much information about those systems as we can get. So array configurations, if we can get them, if we've got equipment specifications, what type of inverters and modules there are, that's great. And we can even use things down to external effects like shading and soiling. And all those things just make those production estimates better. Okay, so we've talked a lot about data and where this data comes from. We work directly with utilities typically, so we are using their interconnection records. So the best place that we can find these things is within PowerClerk. So PowerClerk is an interconnection program management software tool that CPR has licensed to lots of different utilities throughout the US. And so a lot of them have really great interconnection records available within PowerClerk. And these records are very specific, and this is just the best place to get this data for us. We can also take data directly from utilities, as far as like they could just send us a CSV with this data. So a lot of the data, if it doesn't come from PowerClerk, or if the PowerClerk records are incomplete, doesn't contain enough detail for some of the more detailed studies that we're doing. So we can fill in that data, and we can do that. Sometimes statistically works out well. We can also look at building footprints. We can match addresses up to infer some of the specifications, the tilt, the azimuth. But one of the things that we can also do if we don't have any data at all about adopters, is we can use AMI data. So where utilities have AMI data, hourly or better, we can actually go through that data and tell not only if there's a solar or battery system at that location, but we can also infer the specifications. So this is a really cool tool that we have, and this is just a sort of a representation of how we do this. So we take the measured net load from a customer. We take our solar irradiance data from Solar Anywhere, and we can see throughout, each day how the solar irradiance has affected the net load. And we can take that and come up with the specifications for the PV system that makes that all work out. And so you can see we can then reconstitute the simulated gross load. And in this validation study, you can see how close it is to the actual gross load. So this is another option for if you have AMI data, but you don't have specifications. All right, so now that we have a database of the solar adopters and their system sizes, now we want to look at the top of the curve. What is that adoption potential? All right, so we're building these S curves of adoption, and we need to know where the top level of that is. So we're looking for where that line is, and we're also looking for whether or not it's changing over time. And one of the things we can do is a solar resource potential study. So CPR has run many of these. We run them for IRENA, and we also run them for a few utilities within the US. And we take the LiDAR data and we build 3D building models. And then we take those models and get the elevation, tilt, and azimuth for every building within that area. We combine that again with Solar Anywhere data. We do a shading analysis, and we get out hourly PV simulations for every roof surface. All right, so that results in these really pretty maps that are sort of similar to the ones we see from Google Sunroof. And we can aggregate that up to whatever level is useful for the utility, whether that be like zip codes or tracks. And this is a study that we did for OPPD within their service territory. So for adoption modeling, this is really very interesting, and it gives us this like very high upper bound of all of the rooftops in a service territory. But we also layer another thing onto that, which is that not all of these customers will have solar access. And so we we use this idea of solar access to lower that bound even a little bit lower so that we're not over predicting. And so that data that we use for solar access either comes from utilities themselves. They often have metadata about businesses and households in their territory that we can use. And we also use census data. So we have found that the owner-occupied single-family homes often gives us a pretty good proxy of homes, at least in the residential sector, that may be able to to have this solar access. All right, so next I'll talk about the actual adoption rate modeling. So at CPR, we have what we call the flex forecast. It's the way that we do our behind the meter PV adoption modeling. So it is a top-down approach. So we model at the service territory level first, and then we do a geographic breakdown later, much in the same way that Cadeo does. And so we combine historical adoption, the technological costs, socioeconomic data. This all flows into our forecast. And this model is really very simple. It's a very simple logistical regression model. And we want it to be simple because we want it to run quickly, and we want to be able to provide utility planners with abilities to build forecasts really fast and just run through as many scenarios as they'd like. And so this tool uses several CPR's other tools. We use Solar Anywhere for all of the solar calculations, and we also use our state-of-the-art solar rates database for all of the economic like payback type calculations. And this is really great because we can look at different rates, we can look at different solar tariffs. It's made specifically for solar. And so, we can say in California, we've got NEM1, NEM2, NEM3, we can model all of that within our rates database. So it's just a really powerful tool to be able to figure out those really realistic paybacks that people might expect. And then the last thing about this tool is that we are doing this at a service territory or sort of larger geographical area, and then those can flow directly into other tools like integral analytics load seer in order to do sort of more of a granular breakdown. So the model itself is a logistic regression model. Once it is trained, it gives us a probability for each year, and then we apply that back to the pool of customers who have not yet adopted in order to get an adoption number for each year. And this is just a little flow chart of all of the things that we calculate that can go into it. We use market penetration, total system costs, incentives, payback time, and certain social and economic data in order to kind of explain what's happened in the past and be able to project that into future scenarios. And talking about storage, we also don't model storage separately. We are also using an attachment rate fairly similarly. We calculate that attachment rate based on the difference in payback between the two systems, and also based on the value of reliability that the customer might perceive. So to run scenarios, it's really simple. We have just Excel sheets as a template. We use that just because they're really easy to get to all of our customers to get back. They can pass it around easily within their teams. And then they can run scenarios on demand through PowerClerk. And so the results are really fast, less than a few minutes per scenario, can run many scenarios at once. And the results just come back in Excel and CSV formats. We also have a format that goes directly into integral analytics load seer, so trying to make that transition really easy. And so some common scenarios that we see are, effects of pricing, incentives, rates and rate structure changes, solar tariff changes, customer interest in DERs, and valuation of reliability as far as it pertains to solar for storage. Okay, so here's just a couple of different scenarios that we've run recently for residential customers in the Boston area. The green is kind of the base case solar cost. If we use a fairly aggressively decreasing solar cost, we get the orange line. So more solar adopters more quickly, tops out at about 2040 as far as penetration into the system. And then if we do increase solar costs over time, we get the blue line, which obviously is lower adoption over time. Okay, so for adoption location, we take that full territory forecast and we break it down. So this feeds into another separate model using demographic data by geographic area. Most of this data comes from the US Census. So, we can do zip codes, tract levels. We can also kind of massage those into feeder levels if we need to. But we're using data like density, different housing data. We use land cover data from the National Land Cover Database, and then several economic characteristics. And so doing that, we can take our total number of adopters. We can train that model again with using the historic data so we train that model on the historic data and get this annual predicted adopters by geographic area. And that kind of the predicted adopters kind of trickle down through the areas with the highest probability and trickle down from there. All right, so I just want to touch briefly on adoption load impact. Load impact is not a lot of the work that CPR typically does, but we are heavily involved in the production impact, right? So one of the things that we do really well is bulk PV fleet power estimations. And so this is one of our tools from Solar Anywhere. It's called Fleet View. So we can take all of that historical data, all of those systems that are already online, and we can do solar production for all of those systems and aggregate them up to circuit, feeder, substation levels. And we can do this for any time that we have data for. So we can time correlate the data back to net load data for anything back to 1998. We can also do TGY data. We can do real time and forecasted production as well. All right, so just to sort of conclude, I'll show how this all works for a real utility case. So we've been working with Eversource Massachusetts in order to do solar adoption forecasting for them. And so what this looks like is we've got all of their system data in PowerClerk that flows into the adoption model. And also flows into Fleet View for those PV power simulations. And all of that data then flows into LoadSeer in order for them to be able to do their load forecasting, short-term, long-term, and then also their distribution resource planning. And then just as an additional aside, the PV power simulation also goes into some of their system operations. All right, so that's kind of just bringing it all together, and that is it for me. So hand it back to Priya for questions.